Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic that's close to all of our hearts as we get older, nutrition. And not just any nutrition, but the latest and greatest in how we understand what keeps older adults healthy and thriving. We've got a treasure trove of insights here from a recent scientific symposium. A whole bunch of international experts got together and really dug deep into like 18 key areas of nutrition for older adults.
Yeah, it's like a crash course in all the cutting-edge research and thinking in geriatric nutrition. We're talking everything from how our bodies handle food differently as we age to, what we can actually do to stay strong and independent for as long as possible.
So our goal for this deep dive is to sift through all this expert knowledge and give you the most relevant and kind of surprising takeaways. We want to paint a clear picture of what's happening right now in nutrition for older adults without bogging you down with all the technical details.
Right. We want this to be informative and engaging, not a lecture. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's jump in, shall we? One of the things that really caught my eye in the report was this idea of precision nutrition.
Precision nutrition is one of the hottest topics right now.
It sounds futuristic, almost like something out of a sci-fi movie. What's the basic idea?
Basically, it's about moving away from this one-size-fits-all approach to diet and really personalizing what we eat based on each individual's unique characteristics.
So not just like, eat your veggies, drink plenty of water.
Exactly. We're talking about taking into account things like our genes, our metabolism, our environment, even the trillions of bacteria living in our gut, the microbiome.
The report used a condition called phenylketonuria as an example, right?
Yes. Phenylketonuria, or PKU, is a genetic condition where people can't properly break down an amino acid called phenylalanine. For them, a very specific low phenylalanine diet is essential, and they often need to supplement with another amino acid called tyrosine. It's a perfect example of how understanding individual biology can dictate very specific dietary needs.
So that's tailored nutrition. But the experts also made a distinction between that and precision nutrition. What's the difference?
It's a matter of, let's say, sophistication. While tailored nutrition is about personalization in a broader sense, precision nutrition is really all about using data. Lots and lots of data.
Data
Like someone's genetic makeup, how their genes are actually expressed, the composition of their gut microbiome, all sorts of biomarkers. We're talking about using powerful tools, think artificial intelligence and machine learning, to analyze this huge amount of information from many individuals and look for patterns. The goal is to identify the most effective dietary strategies for specific groups of people.
That's amazing. And a little daunting, to be honest. What kind of data would we need to make this precision nutrition a reality for older adults specifically?
Well, the experts highlighted a few things. We need large-scale, long-term studies, cohort studies they're called, that track the diets of lots of older adults over time. And alongside their diet, we need to collect all that detailed biological data.
That omics data you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Think of it as looking at the very building blocks of biology. You've got genomics, which is all about your genes. You've got transcriptomics, which looks at how those genes are actually being used. You've got metabolomics, which studies the small molecules involved in our metabolism. And then, of course, you've got the microbiome. So the goal is to connect all this information to how older adults respond to different foods and eating patterns.
Right. But it's not just about biology, is it?
Nope. We'd also need to consider things like their health conditions, medications, lifestyle factors, even social and economic circumstances. It's a very holistic approach.
So it's a huge, complex puzzle.
Absolutely. It's a major undertaking, but the potential is enormous.
It is exciting to think about a future where we have diets perfectly matched to our individual biology, but it sounds like there's a lot of work to do before that becomes reality.
It's definitely a long-term goal.
So in the meantime, what's the immediate focus?
The priority right now is to make sure we're effectively using what we already know. We have lots of good evidence-based advice on nutrition for older adults. The challenge is getting that information to the people who need it and helping them put it into practice.
Right. Implementation over innovation for now. Speaking of putting things into practice, the symposium also looked at the World Health Organization's efforts during this decade for healthy aging. What's the WHO doing in the realm of nutrition for older adults?
The WHO is heavily invested in this initiative, and they're working closely with ESA and the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism to make sure nutrition is front and center in our efforts to promote healthy aging.
And the focus has really shifted, hasn't it? It's not just about adding years to life, but about adding life to years.
Right. The emphasis is on increasing health span, living those extra years in good health and with a good quality of life. And that's especially crucial for older adults and people living with chronic conditions. The WHO also stresses the importance of considering all the different things that influence healthy aging things, like social connections, access to healthcare, and of course, nutrition.
So it's really about a holistic view of well-being, not just the absence of disease. The report also mentions some specific actions the WHO has taken.
Yes, they've been quite active. For instance, they've developed frameworks and guidance documents, like a recent report on promoting physical activity and healthy diets for healthy aging.
It's great to see these kinds of practical resources being developed.
It is. And the report also highlighted some real-world success stories, countries like Finland and Germany that have implemented effective national policies and programs to improve nutrition and activity levels in older adults. Those are models that other countries can learn from. Looking ahead, the WHO and ESPN are planning to develop more policy briefs, advocate for increased awareness and funding, and create new tools and resources to support good nutritional care for older adults. It's a very active and promising partnership.
Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the gut microbiome. I know it's a hot topic in nutrition these days, but how does it specifically relate to what we eat as we get older?
The gut microbiome is incredibly important throughout our lives, but as we age, it undergoes some pretty significant changes.
What?
Well, both intrinsic factors, things happening within our bodies as we age, and external factors like lifestyle changes and medications can shift the balance of our gut bacteria.
And those shifts are not always for the better, are they?
Unfortunately not. We tend to see a decrease in some of the beneficial bacteria that are associated with, good gut health. Groups like Bifidobacteria, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, Prevotella, these are often linked to reducing inflammation and producing those all-important short-chain fatty acids.
Right. And we need those short-chain fatty acids for a whole bunch of things, from gut health to immunity to brain function.
Absolutely. But it's not all doom and gloom. While some of the good guys decline, other types of bacteria can become more prevalent as we age. Some of these, like Akkermansia and Deuterostomonas, are actually helpful. They contribute to maintaining gut function and producing those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. But then you have others like Bilophila, Escherichia, and Desulfovibrio that have the potential to be harmful. They produce substances that can contribute to inflammation and other problems.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it? You've got both the good and the potentially bad increasing as we get older. And what happens when this balance of bacteria is thrown off?
Well, one of the main concerns is increased gut permeability, sometimes called leaky gut. This means that the lining of the gut becomes more permeable, allowing substances that shouldn't be getting through to leak into the bloodstream.
And that can lead to
Inflammation. Chronic, low-grade inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging.
inflammaging. That sounds kind of ominous.
It can be. Chronic inflammation has been linked to a whole range of age-related problems, from cognitive decline and cardiovascular disease to metabolic issues, and even an increased risk of certain cancers.
Okay, so now for the million-dollar question. Can we do anything about these age-related changes in the gut microbiome through our diet?
The good news is that there's growing evidence that we can. The report highlighted several studies looking at the use of prebiotics, probiotics, and symbiotics in older adults. Prebiotics are like food for the good bacteria, probiotics are the good bacteria themselves, and symbiotics are combinations of both. Some of these studies have shown promising results in terms of modifying the gut microbiome in a positive way, leading to improvements in things like constipation and metabolic health. So yes, what we eat absolutely can influence the composition and function of our gut microbiome even as we age.
Which brings us back to the importance of good nutrition, right?
Always. And it's not just about what we eat, but about understanding how what we eat interacts with this complex ecosystem in our gut. That's becoming increasingly important in the context of healthy aging. We need to make sure older adults are getting enough fiber, as well as a variety of micronutrients that support a healthy and diverse microbiome.
All right. Let's shift our attention to another crucial area, identifying older adults who might be malnourished. It seems like the way we think about and assess malnutrition is evolving.
You're absolutely right. This was a major focus of the symposium. Marion DeVanner Schuren, one of the leading experts in the field, gave a great overview of where malnutrition screening is headed. She pointed out that a lot has changed since those early ESPN guidelines on malnutrition screening came out back in 2003.
What are some of the biggest changes she highlighted?
Well, the demographics are changing. We're seeing a rising prevalence of obesity, even among older adults. Healthcare systems are under increasing pressure from the growing number of older adults, and hospital stays are getting shorter, with a shift toward more care in the community.
Those are big shifts, and they're definitely going to impact how we approach malnutrition screening.
They already are. For instance, a lot of the traditional screening tools rely heavily on BMI and weight loss. But in a population with more obesity, those might not be the most accurate or sensitive indicators. And with more care happening outside of hospitals, we need to be proactive, looking for risk factors that could lead to malnutrition, not just waiting for someone to become severely depleted.
It makes sense to catch those risks early on.
Exactly. And then there's the question of how malnutrition screening fits into the GLM framework, which has really become the gold standard for diagnosing malnutrition. Turns out, the specific screening tool we use can actually influence the diagnostic outcome using GLM. So because of all these changes and questions, the whole idea of malnutrition risk screening is being revisited. We're expecting to see some updated recommendations by the end of 2024.
Interesting. It sounds like we need to be adaptable and keep refining our approach. Speaking of GLM, Tommy Cederholm gave a talk about how well it's working, particularly for older adults, and what the future challenges are. Can you give us a quick overview of GLM and how it works?
Sure. The Global Leadership Initiative on Malnutrition, or GLM, is a framework for diagnosing malnutrition that was published back in 2019. It's a two-step process. First, you screen individuals to see if they're at risk of malnutrition. Then, if they screen positive, you move on to a more detailed assessment. GLM looks at both phenotypic criteria, those are things you can observe, like weight loss, low BMI, and muscle loss, and etiologic criteria, which are the underlying causes, like reduced food intake or the presence of a disease or inflammation. To confirm a diagnosis of malnutrition, you need at least one phenotypic criterion and at least one etiologic criterion.
And the goal was to have a standardized approach that could be used across different settings and populations.
Precisely. One of the main advantages of GLM is that it's meant to be applicable to all adults, regardless of age or setting. Since it came out, there's been a huge amount of research, something like 400 studies, looking at how valid and reliable it is. Researchers have been examining what's called criterion validity, which basically means how well GLM agrees with other established methods for identifying malnutrition. And they've also looked at predictive validity, which is whether a GLM diagnosis can predict negative health outcomes down the line.
So how's GLM performing, specifically when it comes to older adults?
The report highlighted a couple of recent reviews that have looked at this. Early on, there weren't as many studies in older populations, and the quality of the data was sometimes limited. But as more research has come out, the evidence has become much stronger. A compilation of 40 recent studies, published in 2023, pretty definitively shows that GLM has good criterion and predictive validity in older adults. That really supports its use in this population. One important thing to keep in mind is that before using GLM, it's crucial to use a screening tool that is very sensitive. We want to make sure we're catching as many people who are at risk of malnutrition as possible. The report also emphasized the need to take into account age-related changes when interpreting some of the GLM criteria, like BMI.
That makes sense. You want to make sure the criteria are appropriate for the specific population you're working with. Now, we talked about inflammation being one of the etiologic criteria in GLM. Cristina Cuerda gave a talk about the challenges of actually assessing inflammation in practice. Why is inflammation so important in the context of malnutrition?
Well, inflammation, especially when it's chronic and low-grade, as it often is in older adults and people with various illnesses, can really drive malnutrition. When the body's in a state of inflammation, it releases hormones and other signaling molecules that trigger a catabolic state.
Catabolic meaning?
Meaning breaking down. So instead of building and repairing tissues, the body is in a state of breakdown, and that includes muscle tissue. This inflammation-driven catabolism can lead to loss of appetite, muscle wasting, and increased energy expenditure at rest. It can also interfere with the way the body uses micronutrients, meaning people might not be getting the full benefit of the nutrients they consume. And to make matters worse, inflammation can actually reduce the effectiveness of nutritional interventions. So it's a real challenge.
It sounds like a vicious cycle inflammation leading to malnutrition, which can then worsen inflammation. So how do we assess inflammation in the context of GLM?
Well, we can do it both clinically and through laboratory testing. The report highlighted some recently published consensus guidance from a group of experts, and the key takeaway is that, in many cases, clinical judgment is enough. If someone has an acute or chronic condition that is typically associated with inflammation and infection, a chronic inflammatory disease, an injury that's often sufficient to meet the GLM criterion for disease inflammation, we don't necessarily need to do a blood test to confirm it.
But there are situations where a blood test might be helpful.
Of course. If it's not clear from the clinical picture alone, then lab tests, specifically measuring C-reactive protein or CRP, can be used. CRP is a marker of inflammation, and the consensus guidelines provide specific CRP levels that indicate different levels of inflammation severity in both acute and chronic conditions.
Okay, so that gives clinicians some more concrete guidance on when to use lab tests to assess inflammation. Moving on, let's talk about sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and strength that we often see with aging.
Sarcopenia was another big topic at the symposium. Maintaining muscle function is so crucial for older adults to stay independent and active.
And there's been a lot of discussion about the definition of sarcopenia and how to diagnose it. The report mentioned the Global Leadership Initiative on Sarcopenia, or GLIS. What's that all about?
Well, the term sarcopenia has been around for a while, since the late 80s, and the early focus was really on muscle mass. But over the past 15 years or so, there's been a growing recognition that muscle strength and physical function are just as important. We've got like 3 different sets of diagnostic criteria from the EWGSOP, the AWGS, and SDOC, all these different groups. So to try to bring some harmony to the field, the sarcopenia research community came together and formed GLIS, the Global Leadership Initiative on Sarcopenia. It was a big collaborative effort involving experts from all the major groups and supported by a bunch of international organizations.
Sounds like a much-needed initiative. And what were some of the key things they accomplished?
The first thing they did was publish a glossary defining all the key terms used in sarcopenia research, making sure everyone's speaking the same language. Yeah. Then they conducted a modified Delphi process to reach a conceptual definition of sarcopenia.
A Delphi process?
It's a structured process for getting consensus among experts. Over 100 international sarcopenia experts participated. They came up with a conceptual definition, assuming that we have reliable ways of measuring muscle mass, strength, and function. So what do they agree on? Well, the GLIS consensus defines sarcopenia as a generalized muscle disease that becomes more prevalent with age. And the core components are muscle mass, muscle strength, and what they call muscle-specific strength, which is basically your strength relative to your muscle size. They published that definition in early 2024.
So that was a big step forward. But having a definition is one thing. Figuring out how to actually diagnose sarcopenia is another, right?
Exactly. So the next step for GLIS is to operationalize that definition. They've got 3 working groups now, focusing on each of those components: muscle mass, strength, and muscle-specific strength. And they're tasked with coming up with practical, measurable criteria that we can actually use to diagnose sarcopenia. We're expecting those results to be published in the next year or 2. That's going to be a game changer for the field.
It'll be interesting to see what they come up with. Another challenge related to aging and muscle health is sarcopenic obesity. What is that exactly, and why is it so concerning?
Sarcopenic obesity, or SO, is the combination of sarcopenia, so low muscle mass and strength, with obesity, having too much body fat. Rocco Berazzoni spoke about this at the symposium. He explained that both the muscle loss and the fat gain are often linked to age-related changes in lifestyle, becoming less active. But what makes it particularly problematic is that the excess body fat can actually worsen the muscle loss through various metabolic pathways.
So it's like a double whammy, losing muscle and gaining fat, and they're feeding off each other. What are the consequences for health?
Pretty serious, unfortunately. Sarcopenic obesity has been linked to a whole range of negative outcomes: increased risk of frailty, disability, falls, metabolic problems like diabetes and heart disease, a weakened immune system, and even an increased risk of dying. And there's been some talk about an obesity paradox where, in some cases, a higher BMI might be protective for older adults. But when you add sarcopenia into the mix, that potential benefit disappears.
So it's not just about being overweight, it's about the composition of that weight.
Precisely. And historically, it's been tricky to diagnose and manage sarcopenic obesity. There hasn't been a clear consensus on the definition, and measuring muscle mass accurately has been a challenge. But there's good news. A recent international consensus group proposed a diagnostic algorithm for sarcopenic obesity, and it's currently being validated.
So hopefully we'll have a more standardized approach soon. What's the general advice for managing sarcopenic obesity?
The report emphasizes that we have to be careful when managing obesity in older adults. We don't want to make the sarcopenia worse by focusing solely on weight loss. Treatment should focus on strategies that preserve muscle mass, things like exercise, making sure they're getting enough protein, and ideally a combination of both. Regular monitoring of body composition is also really important. We need to track both muscle mass and fat mass.
All right, let's say someone is diagnosed with sarcopenia. What are the recommended nutritional interventions? Can we actually do anything to improve muscle mass through diet?
Gulistan Bahat addressed this question at the symposium. She emphasized that resistance training is always the cornerstone of sarcopenia treatment. That's number one. But nutrition plays a key supporting role. International guidelines on sarcopenia management generally recommend resistance exercise and suggest protein supplementation in conjunction with physical activity.
So, what should someone with sarcopenia focus on nutritionally? What are the key things?
Protein, protein, protein. Getting enough protein is absolutely essential for building and maintaining muscle, especially for someone with sarcopenia. The general recommendation is at least 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. But for those with sarcopenia, it might need to be higher. And it's not just about the total amount, the timing and distribution of protein intake matter too. It's best to aim for about 25-30 grams of protein per meal to maximize muscle protein synthesis.
And is there an optimal time to eat protein, especially for those who are doing resistance training?
Yeah, for people who are exercising, it's good to consume protein within 1 to 2 hours after their workout. That's when the muscles are primed for repair and growth. And then there's the type of protein. Leucine is an amino acid that plays a key role in muscle protein synthesis. So aiming for about 2.5 to 2.8 grams of leucine per meal has been suggested. Of course, it's not all about protein. It's also important to ensure adequate energy intake. If someone isn't eating enough calories overall, their body might start breaking down muscle for energy, and that defeats the purpose.
What about supplements? Vitamin D, for instance, is often mentioned in connection with muscle health.
Right. Vitamin D is important for overall health, including muscle function. But the current evidence doesn't really support taking vitamin D supplements on their own as a treatment for sarcopenia. Other nutrients, like antioxidants and omega-3 fatty acids, are also important for muscle health. But the specific evidence for their role in treating sarcopenia is limited. Overall, the message is that, in addition to adequate protein, we need to focus on promoting healthy dietary patterns as a whole. Those seem to have the greatest potential for both preventing and managing sarcopenia. And of course, any nutritional intervention should be part of a comprehensive, individualized approach that includes exercise, education, and ongoing support from a team of healthcare professionals.
That's a good reminder that nutrition is just one piece of the puzzle. Now, let's talk about another condition that's closely linked to nutrition in older adults: frailty.
Frailty is a big one. Meltem Holil did a great job of explaining this at the symposium. Frailty is essentially a state of decreased physiological reserve and increased vulnerability to stressors. It's characterized by a decline in function across multiple body systems, and it becomes much more common as we get older.
Right, it's like the body's ability to bounce back from challenges starts to decline.
Exactly. And it's a really complex syndrome with a whole bunch of contributing factors: physical, psychological, functional, and social. It's not just about being physically weak. You can have cognitive frailty, for example, or even social frailty. And while it becomes more common with age, frailty can also affect younger adults if they have enough health problems.
And it can manifest in all sorts of ways, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can show up as unintentional weight loss, exhaustion, weakness, slow walking speed, low physical activity levels, and even cognitive issues like confusion or memory problems. And because frailty is dynamic, it can fluctuate. It's super important to assess older adults regularly using tools like the Fried criteria or the Rockwood Index to identify those who might benefit from interventions to prevent or slow down its progression.
And what role does nutrition play in all of this?
Nutrition is absolutely critical. There's a huge amount of overlap between malnutrition, sarcopenia, and frailty. Think about it. Weight loss, loss of muscle mass and strength, reduced appetite. These are all features of both malnutrition and frailty. And because good nutrition is fundamental for maintaining muscle mass, strength, and overall physical function, it's a key player in both preventing and managing frailty. Unfortunately, a lot of frail older adults don't get enough calories or protein in their diet, so addressing malnutrition and sarcopenia should be a top priority in any frailty management plan.
Makes sense. Now, the report also mentioned the WHO's ICOP program. Can you explain what that is and how nutrition fits into it?
Sure. The Integrated Care for Older People, or ICO, is a guidance program launched by the WHO in 2019. Yves Roland spoke about it at the symposium. It's all about optimizing intrinsic capacity and maintaining functional ability, basically, helping older adults make the most of their physical and mental capabilities to stay independent and active. And it takes a very person-centered approach, which is great.
So what does ICOPE actually involve?
Well, they focus on 6 domains of intrinsic capacity: locomotion, or mobility, hearing, vision, mood, cognition, and drumroll vitality nutrition. They recommend that primary care providers screen older adults for declines in any of these areas and then offer appropriate interventions to address any problems. Because these domains are all interconnected, a holistic approach is really key.
It sounds like a really proactive way to support healthy aging. Are there any examples of ICOPE being implemented successfully?
Actually, there are. The Health Age Hospital University Institute of Toulouse in France is a WHO collaborating center, and they've been implementing ICOP in the Occitania region. They've trained over 4,000 healthcare professionals on the program, and they've even developed a digital platform for remote monitoring of older adults using ICOP. A recent study on the feasibility of implementing ICOP showed some interesting results. About 20% of the older adults screened reported weight loss or appetite problems. And even just having a loss of appetite without any other problems in the other ICOP domains was associated with a higher risk of mobility decline, cognitive decline, and low mood 6 months later.
Wow, that's really striking. So even subtle changes in appetite can be a red flag.
It seems so. And this study also found that when those at-risk individuals went through more in-depth assessments, often leading to personalized care plans focused on things like locomotion, nutrition, and cognition, they had better outcomes. It suggests that early intervention can make a big difference.
It's encouraging to see that this kind of proactive, person-centered approach is being implemented successfully on a larger scale.
Right. And it highlights how important it is to screen for these potential problems early on. The report suggests that monitoring these ICOP-T domains and using reference values, what's considered normal for different age groups, could be a simple way to identify older adults who might be at risk of functional decline and need extra support.
That's a really good point. Now let's move on to another interesting topic, anorexia of aging. I have to admit, I'm not entirely clear on what that is.
It's a bit of a confusing term, and unfortunately, there's still no universally agreed upon definition. Jürgen Bauer talked about this at the symposium. He explained that the term has been around since the 80s, but there's a lot of debate about what it actually means. Some people use it interchangeably with malnutrition, but most experts believe it refers specifically to a loss of appetite in older adults. And it's often associated with reduced food intake, but not always. There are also lots of potential causes. It's a multifactorial geriatric syndrome.
So it's more than just not feeling hungry now and then.
Right. It's a persistent problem that can have serious consequences. And it's pretty common, especially in people over 70. It's estimated to affect somewhere between 15% and 60% of older adults living in the community and up to 85% of those in long-term care facilities. And it's a major risk factor for malnutrition and mortality.
Wow, those are significant numbers.
They are. And it's not just about the physical consequences. Anorexia of aging has also been linked to functional decline and poorer quality of life. When it comes to assessing it, the Simplified Nutritional Appetite Questionnaire, or SNAQ, is a useful tool. It's a validated questionnaire that's pretty easy to use in clinical practice. But the problem is we still don't have a lot of good evidence-based treatments for anorexia of aging. The report really emphasizes the need for an international consensus on the definition and for more research on effective interventions.
Sounds like we need to figure out what it is before we can figure out how to treat it.
Exactly. And that's what the experts are calling for, a clear definition and a robust research agenda to guide the development of effective treatments.
Okay, our last topic in this section is metabolic syndrome and its implications for older adults. Why is this relevant to our discussion on nutrition and aging?
Metabolic syndrome, or MS, is often overlooked in older adults, but it's really important. Michela Zanetti spoke about this at the symposium. She highlighted how MS interacts with frailty and contributes to negative health outcomes. Just to recap, metabolic syndrome is a cluster of conditions: increased waist circumference, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and high blood sugar. Having these conditions together increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And it's very common in older people, especially women.
So it's not just a problem for younger people.
Definitely not. And what's really concerning is that in older adults, metabolic syndrome often goes hand in hand with frailty. That combination is a recipe for serious health problems: increased risk of disability, functional decline, falls, and even death. The interesting thing is that the mechanisms linking frailty and metabolic syndrome overlap quite a bit. We see things like changes in body composition, how fat is distributed and how it functions for insulin, sarcopenia, chronic inflammation, and insulin resistance playing a role in both.
So it's like a tangled web of interconnected problems.
It really is. And that means that when we're managing older adults with metabolic syndrome, we need to be thinking about frailty too. We need to identify those who are at risk and tailor our interventions accordingly. Physical activity, good nutrition, those are key for both metabolic syndrome and frailty. And for those with diabetes, which is often part of MS, optimizing blood sugar control is crucial.
Okay, let's move on to the final section of our deep dive, where we look at some of the specific challenges facing healthcare providers when it comes to the nutritional care of older adults. One issue that was brought up is the question of restrictive diets and when, if ever, it's appropriate for older adults to be on them.
Stefan Schneider did a great presentation on this topic. He pointed out that restrictive diets are very common. We see them recommended for weight loss, for managing diabetes, hypertension, heart failure, kidney disease, hypercholesterolemia, a whole range of conditions that become more common as we get older. But the situation for older adults is more nuanced. We have to consider the potential downsides of these diets more carefully.
For instance, when it comes to weight loss, we often think of it as a good thing. But is that always true for older adults?
Not necessarily. There's been some really interesting research suggesting that for older adults, a BMI in the overweight category might actually be associated with better survival, better physical function, and even some protection against osteoporosis. Despite that, we see lots of older adults, even those in their 70s and 80s, going on restrictive diets for weight loss. And that can backfire because it can worsen sarcopenia, that age-related muscle loss, and lead to sarcopenic obesity. One study showed that octogenarian outpatients who were on restrictive diets had a 3.5-fold increased risk of malnutrition.
Wow, that's a pretty big risk. What about other types of dietary restrictions, like limiting salt for heart failure, for example?
Yeah, that's another area where the traditional advice might need to be adjusted for older adults. While short-term salt restriction can be beneficial during an acute heart failure episode, the long-term benefits are less clear. And the potential risks, especially for older adults, are significant. So the overall method from the report and from Ease and Pain guidelines is that we need to be very cautious about using restrictive diets in older adults. We need to carefully weigh the potential benefits against the risks, taking into account individual factors and preferences, and focus on other strategies like physical activity. And as healthcare providers, we need to be aware of any restrictive diets our older patients might be following, because that could be a modifiable factor contributing to malnutrition.
Makes sense. We need to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach and think about what's appropriate for each individual. Now, another big challenge in geriatric nutrition is managing the interactions between nutrients and drugs.
Polypharmacy taking multiple medications is a major issue in older adults because they tend to have more chronic health conditions. Kutay Demirkan talked about this at the symposium. He emphasized that on top of the normal age-related changes in the way our bodies process drugs and nutrients, we also have to consider the potential for drug interactions and nutrient-drug interactions when someone is taking multiple medications. And these interactions can go both ways. Nutrients can affect how well drugs are absorbed,